and a quick thumbs up or yes, I can see it. If you can see my screen. All right, I see thumbs up, so I'm gonna say we're good to go. Thank you, David and Peter. So basically, agenda. I'm going to give a quick introduction to the Freethinker Institute. I'm going to talk about a bunch of things that I have heard about the vaccine. One person told me that the US is doctoring numbers, so I'm going to address that hypothesis. I'm going to address whether or not someone is safer when they're vaccinated versus not vaccinated. And take into consideration, another thing that I've heard is the threat of the vaccine itself, and that is really important to take into consideration. Is there is a risk when you take the vaccine. There's a mortality risk, and I'm mostly dealing tonight with mortality risk to make it a little more cut and dry, not with collateral potential complications, because that adds a whole nother level of complexity of like how big of a collateral impact is there, or how big of a non-fatal impact is there. And so I didn't want to get into that because I felt like it would digress us a little bit. And so I kept mostly focused on the numbers around mortality rate, meaning whether or not you die from taking the vaccine, from getting COVID, et cetera. So we're going to talk about whether or not someone is safer vaccinated or unvaccinated, also considering the threats of the vaccine itself, which does have a risk, which is very carefully tracked. And then we're going to talk about when the COVID vaccine is dangerous and what you do in that case. We're going to talk about the big COVID risk factors. We have an at-risk person tonight, and thank you for coming, Richard, and for sharing your story. And then we're going to talk about the hypothesis that COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast from Christianity. And we'll talk about that hypothesis. And I forgot to include in the agenda, but I did add the Bill Gates microchip hypothesis in here as well. And I'll address that one too. And then we're also going to talk about whether or not it's important to stay boosted from the COVID vaccine, if we agree that it even makes sense to be vaccinated in the first place. Then the next question is, does it make sense to get boosted? And David made the comment that it's a small minority of people that are anti-vax, and actually, like statistically in the US, that's true. I think about 70% of people are vaccinated, but actually only about a third of the population is fully vaccinated, which means boosted up to the current levels of vaccination that are possible. So that actually puts people that are boosted into the minority, which is interesting. And so I wanted to really tackle this problem with a very objective view. I try to do that with everything we do at the Freethinker Institute, is like put all of my personal beliefs and bias aside and just look at the numbers and the data and interpret it with good faith, at seeking truth, being the best version of myself, and being fair, which is what the first intention of the Freethinker Institute is about. And so that's what we're going to go through tonight, is my analysis. I spent many hours pouring through numbers and creating Excel spreadsheets that practically crashed my computer. Luckily, I have a lot of memory, so I managed to get through it. But let me start with what the Freethinker Institute is about. We want to be a warm, open-minded community that helps people in both personal and professional development and growth. And we want to maximize happiness and minimize harm, as Ella said. And we want to embrace diverse ideas. And so this is a place where everybody can share whatever opinion they want. If you're very strongly pro-vax, if you're very strongly anti-vax, we want you to feel comfortable sharing your opinion, and no one is allowed to say you're wrong. We're allowed to say we disagree with you and this is why, but it's not up to us to say whether or not someone else is wrong. In the Freethinker Institute, it's up to each person to come to their own conclusion based on their own ability to reason. And we want to teach people to rely on their ability to reason more effectively, rather than to tell them what to think. And that said, we want to create a world where everyone makes enough money that money no longer buys happiness. That's about 100,000 USD a year in modern USD dollars. According to when the study was done, it was about 75K a year. And we want transformational personal and professional growth, and to spread good ideas, basically. So our online community, Ellis has shared, and we would love for you guys to join. We have great conversations in there. Sometimes those do get heated, although most of the time they're very polite and intellectually gratifying. So hope you guys will join for the online community throughout the week. That said, I'm going to talk a little bit about game theory, which is essentially what the way that I approach this subject is to talk about, we really have ultimately a simple decision of to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. That is the question, to sort of paraphrase Hamlet, for those that are Shakespeare fans. And basically we're going to look at the numbers of if you vaccinate or if you don't vaccinate, with all other aspects considered, between the vaccination and the non-vaccination decision. And then we're also going to add on to that, I forgot to add back to the slide, is if you fully booster or not. And so there's don't vaccinate, vaccinate but don't booster, and then there's fully boosted and vaccinated. So those are the three sort of scenarios that we're going to analyze and compare. So first of all, when I talked with one of my friends about this, who is very anti-vax, she said that the US is doctoring their numbers. So I basically said I need to do a global look at vaccination and mortality rates and see whether or not the US numbers are completely out of kilter. I will tell you what I found is that the North Korean numbers were out of kilter, because they had actually 6 deaths per single infection. Now, how is that possible, you might ask? How do you get 6 people dying from one infection? Well, it doesn't make logical sense. Not much in North Korea makes logical sense. And what it comes down to is they probably don't want to admit as many people as have coronavirus, or they're just not testing people. And so they don't want to admit the number of cases they have, but they probably can't hide the deaths because there's body bags and there's independent people that can validate these things. So, but in general, there was, if we look at the broad categories of mortality rates, we'd look at lower middle income, high income, low income, and upper middle income countries. And roughly the mortality rates were between 2% and 3%. That basically tells me that, the US, which is in that range, is not really doctoring its numbers because it's right in line with the global perspective of mortality rates. So I sort of said, the hypothesis that the US is doctoring its numbers doesn't make sense. The other thing to keep in mind is that the level of conspiracy theory that you would need to have is so great that you would need, the hugely vast majority of people that are involved in COVID tracking to be in on that conspiracy. And there's really no, motive for those people to be in on a conspiracy about COVID, which is one of the big questions that I ask in this game theory hypothesis is, what are the motives for people? Because if someone doesn't have a motive for something, they generally don't do it, right? People don't just randomly create fictitious information or, lie blatantly for no reason whatsoever. People usually have a motive for their reasons for doing things. And so that's another thing to take into consideration. When you look at individual countries as a whole, about the number of confirmed cases and deaths, it's a little bit more diverse than the prior one, which looked at the broad categories of the 3 socioeconomically stratified types of countries. But you still end up with the US being, roughly within a normal case. And you also notice that there is a lot of diversity, but it's not, there also is a lot of diversity in the types of government and the level of trust in governments. And like we talked about with North Korea, we can't really trust the North Korean government to accurately report COVID statistics. So, they don't accurately report very much outside of their own internal government, quite frankly, not even to their own people. So that said, I've also heard people say that the most number of people that are dying are vaccinated. And so they say, well, if most of the people dying are vaccinated, doesn't that mean the vaccine is dangerous? That might might be like a conclusion that people could come to, but actually it's a misunderstanding of statistics. The truth is, if you actually look at the portion of people that are vaccinated is much higher. So if the vast majority of people are vaccinated, it actually sort of makes sense that at some points in time that more people that were dying are vaccinated because so many more people are vaccinated. But really what you want to look at is the risk to you as an individual about whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated. And so that's what this chart below does, is it says, what is the risk of death for 100,000 people? Like how many people die? This is an average weekly rate. So that's why the numbers are not commensurate with the 2 to 3% death rate, or mortality rate, I should say. In a week, unvaccinated people are hugely more likely to die than vaccinated, who are also very significantly more likely to die than people who are boosted, more than twice as likely to die. So if you look at the statistics in the way that looks at you as an individual and what your personal risk is of dying if you have the vaccine or not have the vaccine, this is what the numbers look at. Now, we have not taken into consideration yet the risks of taking the vaccine itself. We will get to that before the end of the presentation. So what about if I'm severely allergic to the COVID-19 vaccine or severely immunocompromised? If you take a first shot of the vaccine and you have a bad allergic reaction, or if you're immunocompromised and you're not a good candidate for getting the vaccine, there are a bunch of questions asked about before you take the vaccine that say whether or not you're eligible for it. If you don't pass based on those things, there's something called Evusheld, which you can take as a, by the way, Austin, sorry, we save all questions for after the presentation. So if you don't mind just taking a note with your question, and then we'll definitely get to it. We'll have plenty of time. My presentation won't take too long. It'll go pretty quick. And so for anyone interested, I am going to share the slides. After I present, I'll stop the screen share and I'll share the slides with the group so that anyone that wants the links can use them. And so Evusheld is a way to protect yourself from coronavirus for those that are, highly allergic against the vaccine and still want protection from COVID, because those, if this very high mortality rate compared to vaccinated and boosted makes you feel uncomfortable with being unvaccinated, then, and yet you're not a good candidate for the vaccine, then Evusheld can be, an alternative. When we look at total number of deaths from COVID-19 based on age group, we notice that it's people over 50 that are the most vulnerable. It's the very vast majority of deaths that are coming from the older people in the population, the most knowledgeable, the most wise. Although I like to say age is an opportunity for wisdom. Some of us take advantage of it and some don't. So age does not necessarily mean wisdom, but it gives us the opportunity to be wise. I highly encourage everyone to take advantage of that and seek wisdom, because that's a great thing. Spiritual growth and development, I would argue, is one of the meanings of life. And so it's a good thing to go after. And so this means that some of our most skilled and knowledgeable people die way more often of coronavirus. So that's just something to take into consideration. Age is the largest factor in terms of mortality risk in coronavirus, but there are others. And there are a lot of other factors. And I have a link here to the other factors that make someone more vulnerable to coronavirus. Richard mentioned a bunch that he, a bunch of, areas which made him more vulnerable. Thank you for that. But if you want to see the full list, the CDC offers a large list of underlying conditions that make someone more vulnerable to coronavirus. Some people have said that coronavirus is the mark of the beast from the Bible. So for those not familiar from the Bible, I took a few passages from the Bible talking about the mark of the beast. And basically this is, biblical beasts that come back and mark people with a mark to say that they are not basically followers of God. Now, the first quote is, he, the beast of the sea, also forced everyone, small and rich and poor, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. So first of all, nobody was prohibited from buying and selling. You may not have been allowed to go into a restaurant, but you're still allowed to buy and sell on the internet. You're still allowed to buy and sell houses, lots of stuff that was still allowed to be bought and sold. And the other thing is that a vaccine is not a mark on the right hand or the forehead, right? It's in your left or your right arm, but it's not in the hand or the forehead. So that doesn't really jive with being the mark of the beast. The other one is, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or right hand. So I covered that. The vaccine is not on the forehead or right hand. So here's the other thing is that I heard that there are microchips from Bill Gates in the COVID vaccine. So actually it's good to know, someone mentioned earlier about where this information comes from. It's always good to know where the sources are. The head of the Russian Communist Party said at one point that globalists supported a covert mass chip implantation, which they may at some time resort as a mandatory vaccination against coronavirus. Now, he didn't mention the name of Mr. Gates, but Roger Stone said that Bill Gates and others were using the virus for microchipping people so that we can tell whether or not they've been tested. Well, why does Bill Gates care if you've been tested on coronavirus? Like, what's even his motive for caring? And even if he did care, there's actually no known technology that will allow nanochips to have a far enough range. I'm a computer science major and technologist. I built microchips, and there's no known technology that will allow a nanochip enough range for anyone outside of the body to detect anything from those nanochips. So there's no known technology that's publicly available, which means you'd have to have this huge conspiracy of this super cool technology, which, by the way, you would make billions of dollars on this technology if it existed, but somehow you're going to keep this technology secret and only Bill Gates knows about it. And somehow he managed to get it into a vaccine that is, globally distributed without any government checking whether or not there were microchips in it. So you realize that this story doesn't become very plausible when you apply critical thinking to the story. Now, most people don't apply critical thinking to the story. They just get angry and they hate Bill Gates. And I get the sort of seduction of just being angry at someone else and saying that they're the reason that everything is going wrong. But that's not really the right answer, right? Finding a scapegoat and finding someone to blame is not the way that you solve your problems. Finding the root cause of the problem is what critical thinking is about. And finding the real root cause of the problem so you can solve that problem at its root cause is what helps make you and the people around you happier and reduces the harm that you and the people around you experience. So other quotes from the Mark of the Beast, I put the Bill Gates thing in. I did this during the event because I realized I had the microchip thing left out. So I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. The beast I saw was like a leopard, and its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. Now, so far as I've heard, there have been no accounts from any news sources that beasts that look like this have come out of the sea. And if they haven't, it's not yet end of times, Christians. It's not yet end of times. And so while I love Christ's messages, and I think I would be considered a Christian by many, many ways of looking at it, the Bible is very clear about what the beast looks like, and you don't get the mark of the beast without the beast. So, without any, possible ways of the beast having been detected on Earth, how can we think that this vaccine is the mark of the beast? So that said, I'm going to give a quick summary. And in this summary, I'm going to basically include the chance of death, the mortality rate basically of 1 million people per million people of unvaccinated, and the vaccine death if you vaccinate and boost. So if you're unvaccinated, 171 people die. If you vaccinate and boost, the chance of dying from vaccinating is 27 as opposed to that 171. And then if you vaccinate, only one compared to that 171 actually die of COVID. So you're infinitesimally smaller. Now, the truth is the vaccinating is actually more dangerous. And I think that I included basically what it shows is that if you choose not to vaccinate, you're 6 times more likely to die from the decision of choosing not to vaccinate than you would be of the decision of choosing to vaccinate, even including the risks of the vaccine itself, just because of how much it lowers the chance of dying of COVID. And mind you, this unvaccinated number includes people that have natural immunity, right? Because people with natural immunity were also unvaccinated. So don't think that natural immunity absolves you of this risk. It doesn't. Natural immunity still is included in the unvaccinated people because the ones that survive the first bout of COVID then get the next bout of COVID and then have the same, a mortality risk at the next one. So this is the overall mortality risk, including from natural immunity. So natural immunity does not get us out of this. The other thing to note is that natural immunity doesn't eliminate coronavirus as a disease. If you look at the efficacy, and I didn't put these numbers in, I'm going to do this off the top of my head. If you look at the efficacy of the coronavirus vaccine in terms of resisting, a lot of people say, well, even if you're vaccinated, you can still get coronavirus. Well, that's true, but the rough estimate of resistance of coronavirus is about 95% if you're vaccinated. And so you're way less likely to get coronavirus if you are vaccinated. Whereas if you are vaccinated against other diseases like polio, the percentage chance of getting it is actually much lower, or the percentage chance of resisting it is actually much lower than 95%. The 95% that coronavirus has is, I believe it's actually the truly highest disease resistance rate of any vaccine. That may be because it's an mRNA vaccine, but I will just say, like, it's a very high resistance rate, whereas the other vaccines that have been around for 100 years or so have much lower resistance rates. But because a vast majority of people get them, it stops the spread of the disease to the point where so few people get the disease, like can spread the disease, that the disease actually dies out. And in fact, speaking of Bill Gates Foundation more or less single-handedly eliminated polio from Africa. So talk about a major accomplishment. By vaccinating enough people against polio in Africa, he eliminated polio from the continent of Africa. And I used to dislike Bill Gates quite a bit when he used to be a greedy guy and not donate any money to charity. And then he got a lot of flack for it publicly, and then he became the biggest philanthropist in the world. So there's a kudos to social pressure for people giving him a big guilt trip. But now I'm actually pretty impressed at the stuff that he's done with the money that he's put towards doing good. And he's also put his own brains behind his philanthropy and used that pretty capable brain of his at helping make the world a better place. So that said, there are also a lot of non-fatal risks. But even if we took the non-fatal risks, and I mentioned this earlier, I did actually run the numbers of, even if you took every non-fatal risk of vaccinating as fatal, you would still be 2 times safer vaccinating and boosting than you would not vaccinating and boosting, assuming that you died of every non-fatal risk, which means that even considering non-fatal risks of vaccinating, you're literally twice as safe, taking them to the extreme where a non-fatal risk you're taking as fatal, you're still 2 times safer vaccinating than you are not vaccinating. So this is a graph that shows the primary vaccine and 2 boosters, and the mortality rate is roughly, and it changes a little bit over time, but it's roughly well, a little bit under a third if you're fully boosted versus just getting vaccinated. You're pretty much a third less likely to die. So, and if you've gotten the first vaccine and you didn't have an allergic reaction to it, the chances of having an allergic reaction to a future one are infinitesimally small. Like, it's very unlikely. You're usually going to get that allergic reaction to the first time you get exposed to the vaccine. So this I found a really interesting statistic. Especially, it was actually a member of one of the meetup groups, and her comments unfortunately were deleted, which I felt bad about. The organizer said he didn't delete them, so I don't know why they got deleted, but she was the one that pointed out to me that only roughly a third of the population is currently boosted. And that's what made me pull up this graph to show, being fully boosted really does make a big difference. I mean, it, more than halves your mortality rate by being fully boosted. So highly encourage people to either fully booster or share with us in this event why you would not want to vaccinate and fully booster, which I'm very open to hearing. Having an open mind, like I said, is one of the 5 intentions of the Freethinker Institute. So I will listen to all of you with an open mind. You can see where me looking at the data sent me is in favor of vaccination and boostering, because it just seemed like the mortality rates are higher, drastically higher actually, by not vaccinating, and the risks of vaccinating are very low and much lower than the risks of not vaccinating. And all the reasons not to vaccinate other than that, which were the microchips and the mark of the beast, if there are any other ones and the US is doctoring its data, those were the 3 reasons that I've heard. I try to address each of those, but if people have other reasons or reasons that my logic might be faulty in any of these, I'll welcome that in the conversation portion of the event. With that said, I guess let's save these questions until after we have the conversation. So now let me open it up for questions. Just go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions, comments, anything that didn't make sense to you, didn't resonate with you, people with alternate opinions. Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Well, I'm very much pro-vaccine. But that being said, I'm currently against very harsh mandates. I was a lot more for it in the beginning because there wasn't much data available. They claimed that it would prevent new variants from arising. That doesn't have to seem as pan out as much. I'm boosted. I have the latest bivalent one, and for me at least, it works great because a few members of my family had COVID, and my mother was actually staying with me when she got COVID, and I didn't have any symptoms whatsoever. So I'm definitely a believer. As far as the doctoring data, I think there was some, I wouldn't call it doctoring because that implies, they were trying to trick somebody. But I do have quite a few friends in the medical field who work in hospitals, nurses, and doctors. And when the pandemic started, they would mark people that died from other similar conditions as having COVID. I don't think it was to trick anybody. It was just the volume was so large and they were inundated, and PCR testing wasn't as available. So it was just more of a precautionary measure. I don't think it was designed to alter any specific statistics.
That might explain. Go ahead. And I forgot to say in the beginning, we usually want to let people ask one question or make one comment, and each time they raise their hand.
Okay. Well, I got pretty much the gist of it out. So
no problem. Thanks. And you're totally welcome to raise your hand a second time and then just get back in line. I just want to sure. I want to be able to respond to everybody and not have it be a really long back and forth. So to answer your first comment about vaccinating, being able to stop variants. Actually, if we eliminated coronavirus, there would be no more variants because coronavirus would be eliminated. And if the vast majority of the population was vaccinated against coronavirus like they are against polio, which, by the way, you can't go to public schools without a polio vaccine, a measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. There's a whole host of vaccines that you can't go to public school without. And so almost everybody in the population is vaccinated against those things. Those things are eliminated. So actually, coronavirus could potentially be eliminated if we got a vaccine mandate, which is not
I
currently
think
a
it
reality.
spread too much all over the world. Polio was never as prevalent as COVID, and it wasn't as transmissible. If you look
Yeah,
at statistics, how
it's
many
not as
people actually got
transmissible.
polio,
Yep.
it's a much lower rate than COVID. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I would recommend everybody does get vaccinated and boosted, because just for personal risk would go down a lot. I don't know whether it would probably lower the risk of COVID, spreading, but I'm weighing against, personal choice, right? For myself, that decision is a no-brainer, but forcing other people, I'm a little, iffy on that.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Gene. The other thing to take into consideration is people like Richard who are at high risk. And I guess I see the social good of everybody vaccinating as not only defending themselves, but also defending other people by spreading the virus less often.
I think it
That
would be a
said,
good idea, yeah, but I don't, but forcing people, that's where kind of, I need a little more data to go on before I would back that.
got it. Why don't you think about what data you would need in order to back forced vaccination, just out of curiosity? Don't answer it right
Statistics,
now. Don't answer it right now, because I want to we have a couple people with hands up and I want to let them answer. But go ahead and think about it. I didn't even think about the idea of forced vaccination. I didn't even address it in the topic, so I haven't really thought about it deeply. But I would be curious to know,
Well, if you
if
can't
you,
go to work unless you're vaccinated, that's sort of de facto forcing,
well, that's true.
nobody's
That's
gonna
true right
judge
now.
you
Like,
with it.
people at large companies are not allowed to go to work without the vaccine, is my understanding. So, I think that is somewhat already
I
true.
mean,
So
certain
that,
industries that would, if you work in a hospital, that should be mandated, because the risk is so high of you
right,
spreading it. People are usually in the hospital because they're sick already,
right,
so they might be immunocompromised. So certain, but there should be some kind of, I think, rational limits on that.
got it. So Richard, why don't you go next?
I believe in the theory of evolution. I was a PhD in aerospace engineering, but a minor in math, and statistics is included in that. And the conclusions that you get if you model the transmission of COVID is that we're going to keep getting new variations of the virus as long as it keeps propagating. If you could stop everybody from developing the disease, there would be no more variation. And therefore, that final vaccine would do the job. And the other thing I wonder about is where you got the number of 27 per million dying from the vaccine.
I think that was like a weekly number rather than an absolute number, Richard. So I apologize for that. I noticed that when it came up, but it was proportional to the per 100,000, but I don't think it was in absolute terms correct. So thank you for pointing that out. But it was, what I did is I looked at all of the mortality risks of taking the vaccine, and the sources are in the presentation, by the way, so you can go to the sources. I'll actually let me share the presentation here and people can go to the sources in the event. But yeah, the sources are all in the presentation. So I'll share that for you. But you're right that there was something wrong there because the numbers were too low. The overall mortality rate numbers were too low for the 2 to 3% mortality rate that we see. So there was a time series off. But I was more looking for like a comparison of if you take the vaccine versus if you don't take the vaccine, what is the proportion of mortality risk? Does that make sense, Richard?
Do you mean mortality risks from all causes?
From dying of coronavirus versus dying of the coronavirus vaccine. So those are the two causes that I'm taking into consideration. So if you don't vaccinate, what's the mortality risk of dying of coronavirus? If you do vaccinate, what's the mortality risk of having taken the vaccine and coronavirus added together?
I don't understand how that. Are you saying the people who are vaccinated then catch the COVID and die from that.
Correct, which is very low risk, very low risk,
Well, lower.
very low. It's extremely low. Yeah, if you have the COVID vaccine, then you're at very minuscule risk of dying of COVID.
Well, you showed a factor of 1/7.
So if I go back to the number, let me pull up I'll pull up the actual data, and we'll let Peter go, and then I'm going to come back to it after we've let Peter and possibly Rachel go. Before I don't want to answer you before I've actually looked at the source data. So Peter, why don't you go next?
Just very briefly, my first degree is an Ivy League biology, anatomy and physiology background. There's some fallacies that most folks have been told, including that you can eradicate a virus, and that vaccines have done that. That's not actually true. Polio, if you want to use that as an example, was arguably more stamped out by modern sanitation coming to Africa and impoverished areas than the vaccine. The vaccine actually came in after the fact, if you look at it on a timeline. The other thing I would ask is that everybody ask themselves, how many of your childhood vaccines did you receive and not feel protected by? If the vaccination, if this so-called vaccination protects you, then as a debate topic, this was really kind of a moot point, because if a person who's received the shots is protected, then there shouldn't be any concern on their part about working alongside or traveling in an elevator with someone who hasn't received the shot. Because that vaccine, if it is truly a vaccine, should shield you, and you should be personally protected, and theoretically lower the transmission rate.
So Peter, I also have an Ivy League degree from my undergrad, and I think you actually have perhaps a possible misunderstanding there. So I just posted a link showing things that we don't have to worry about because of vaccines. And I'm pretty confident that there have been, and I don't have the time to fact check it during the event, but we can do it afterward and talk about it in the online community. I'm pretty confident that some of the things that have been vaccinated against have, smallpox, that's the one. It has been completely eradicated from Earth. Well, except for labs. Labs have smallpox, but you can try to find a source of natural occurring smallpox in the last 2 decades. Post your source in the chat, but my understanding is it's been completely eradicated. So again, the other I forget the other thing that you said that I wanted to comment on, but go ahead and respond to that.
Virologists can't even tell you where viruses are sourced from. Okay, they'll search in the wild and capture bats and so on and say, oh, we have a reservoir, but they don't know the origin of it. They don't know if it's a shed genetic entity from naturally occurring organisms. They don't know where it's originally sourced from the environment. So to think that you can eradicate it is a falsehood. It also doesn't take into account that people can walk around as quote unquote carriers, have no symptoms, not be ill, and have incorporated retroviruses, for example, as carriers or into their own genome. And it does not mean that the virus is eradicated. It just means it hasn't been expressed as an illness. So if someone else has a compromised system, it could be an illness.
The last time smallpox has been seen in a human was 1975. Is your hypothesis that smallpox has not been seen in a human since 1975, but it's still moving around the earth secretly, amongst other things, and may come back to humans at some point in the future? Is that your hypothesis?
Certainly.
Okay, I mean, you're welcome to believe that if that's the conclusion you come to after really using your critical thinking skills, and that's what you believe is the most likely truth. But I find that a very unlikely truth, for myself. But you're welcome. Look, you're welcome to believe what you want to believe.
No, I'm meaning no disrespect, but
yeah,
your sources are all, for your data sets were all CDC sourced. There is conflicting data out there. It takes some digging to get to it, but because it has unfortunately been suppressed. But
well, you would have to provide a source for that. And if the source is politically biased, I would encourage you to look for a politically unbiased source that says the same thing, because there are politically biased sources that actually tell mistruths with the intent of basically selling fake news. So you need to be aware that there's a lot of fake news going out there, and a lot of the people screaming that other news is fake news are the ones spreading fake news. So let's just keep that in mind, that if you don't have an independent source that is not politically biased saying something that sounds really crazy and scary, possibly it's misinformation.
I'm not talking about scary. I'm just saying, factual in the sense, can you trust the CDC?
I mean, who can you trust? That's my question, is why don't you write down a list of people that you can trust, Peter? And I would love to see your list of people that you can trust. Because, do you trust your doctor? Do you trust your primary care doctor? Do you trust your, so who do you trust would be my question if you don't trust the CDC. That said, there's a lot of hands up, so I want to go to Rachel next.
Thanks. I was just going to bring up some data from, his name is Edward Dowd, and he actually came across it. He's in equity investment, so not related to the health field whatsoever, but he came across it, and it's the CDC's data, and it is the excess death data. I don't think you touched on this specifically, right, in your presentation?
Which part?
The excess death data.
What does excess deaths mean?
So it's just this data that came out. It's essentially like we're seeing more deaths than what we should be seeing, and there is this trend that happened in fall of last year where people between ages 25 and 44 were dying. And an interesting correlation that hasn't been proved as causation per se, but is that what you and Jean touched on, where people were being forced to get vaccinated to go to work if they worked for like a bigger corporation. So I guess I'm just curious about, like, if you would acknowledge that data. I could try to post something in the chat, and also
post the link, and I'll look at it and I'll follow up with it offline, and share the results in the online community. I have actually, now that you mention it, I didn't remember that hypothesis, but I think I have vaguely heard it, but I only heard it like one time from one person, so I didn't know it was a prevalent thing that people believed in, so I didn't look at it carefully. So I'll look at it more carefully.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. David.
Yeah, I was just, I was going to say, if you hope to eradicate COVID, you're dreaming, because the common cold and the regular seasonal flu, they're ongoing. And the COVID vaccine is primarily to lower the incidence of serious illness. It's the focus isn't on total eradication. It'd be nice, but viruses are incredibly slippery and adaptable, and but just lowering the fact that far fewer people die from having the vaccine, that's a fantastic goal, especially if you're one of them. So, to me, this is a very specious argument if anyone's arguing against vaccines. But you have to lead your life according to your own lights, and don't vaccinate if you really don't believe in it. But there's lots of people that don't believe in, well, all sorts of things. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
There's also lots of people who believe that Earth is flat, and that there are Yeti, and that there's a Loch Ness monster, and and look, I'm not going to tell them they're wrong if they really fundamentally have looked inside themselves and believe that that's the truth. And I think ultimately everybody has to trust their own judgment first and foremost. all I would consider is, all I would recommend is that everybody look with an open mind and, transparently share their beliefs and listen with an open mind to other people's beliefs and see whether or not someone else may have a better reason for believing what they believe than what we currently believe. So thank you for that, David. And you may be right. All I would say about trying to eradicate coronavirus is the idea of virality. Like when we say things spread virally, it means for everyone that gets it, that they share it with more than one person. If you can vaccinate enough people that there's no more virality to the virus, that virus can be eliminated within a population over a period of time. The question is whether or not, and I don't have the statistics to back up whether or not, coronavirus could be eliminated. Although I will say that China supposedly did eliminate it for a period of time, although then it came back in spades. So, whether or not it could be eliminated globally is another story. That said, Gene has his hand up, so go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I think comparing COVID to smallpox is a little bit like, it's not even apples and oranges. I think those would be more related, because smallpox, first of all, has a much higher mortality rate. So basically, more people, if they have it, they would just die, it would die out with them. And not all vaccines are created equal. Some are more effective against, completely catching a disease. Some just prevent, like COVID vaccines don't prevent you from catching it. They prevent you from having a high risk of mortality or ending up in the hospital on the ventilator. It does not prevent you from it doesn't make you completely immune to it. So comparing those is a little bit different.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I wasn't intending to compare smallpox to coronavirus as like an apples to apples comparison. I was just saying, I think the assertion was that vaccines have never eliminated anything from the earth. And my assertion was, no, vaccines actually have eliminated smallpox from earth because it's never been seen since 1975. And so if you haven't seen a disease for, 20, 30, 40 years, like, I'm going to believe that it's gone off the earth, except for in labs, like government labs do have versions of smallpox, but
maybe some Amazonian uncontact tribes might have it or something, but yeah, it's no longer really a problem.
I mean, people interact with Amazonian tribes, right? So even if the Amazonian tribes had it, it would eventually get out.
Just an extreme example. I mean, there could be some.
I'm just saying, like, and again, that's why I said if he wants to believe that it still exists on Earth, he's welcome to do it, like in the wild. But
I don't think it's a problem anymore.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. I'm going to worry about other things other than smallpox. That said, Sean, go ahead.
I had my first flu shot in 1998. Before that, I never thought that flu or just like cold that a big deal. Since I'm healthy, good shape, I never in my mind that flu was a big problem. Strangely enough, okay, in 1998, after the flu shot, I got flu, okay. And I, of course, I can use this to tell people vaccine no good, okay. Look, I never had a vaccine before, I'm okay. Just right after I had a vaccine, I got flu, right? Well, if you look deeper, right, flu virus mutate every year, a different strain. Maybe in my case, that year, new strain did not include in that flu shot, so I got it, okay? This is why we have to know the special case or general case. And also, like how you present the data was a big thing. Say, I just talked to Austin. Say, Austin think, okay, Mongolia, they had a, because they basically like a herd, sheep, those things. So people living in that life may be naturally immune to vaccines. Actually, it's not, okay. Even I just did a little Google Mongolia had about 1 million people infected. Compared with US, right? That's the last one. US has 100 million, right? People would you can use this and say, okay, Mongolia only have 1 million people infected. US have a lot. However, we need to look at the population. US population is 100 times bigger than Mongolia, okay? So the infection rate, Mongolia and US the same. However, death rate US much higher than Mongolia. Why? That's also science in it. I'm sorry, US have much higher obese rate, okay? And also have higher aging people or some people with health problem. So our death rate much higher than Mongolia, okay? It's not because of vaccine, right? You cannot say because US have vaccine, we have same infection rate or we have more people die. You can use that to argue, say vaccine do no good. But we need to look deeper, okay, right? We have more obese people. We have so many people have heart disease, diabetic, a lot of problems. Mongolian people, the herd people, right? They work a lot. They're in good shape. Even though they're infected, the death rate is much lower than US, which makes sense, right? Right, I'm done.
And thank you, Sean.
Oh, one more thing, but I'm absolutely believe science. I think vaccine is a wonder. It's God given to help humans, okay? Without a vaccine, so many things, simple things, smallpox, measles, polio, I don't know, it's probably ravaged the world right now, okay? There's no way we deal with it. So I believe vaccine.
Great, thank you, Sean. And you're right. You said in the chat that no one said vaccines will eliminate all viruses. That is true. I think it will, it could potentially eliminate some, but I think that it has eliminated smallpox, in my opinion. But I realize there's a difference of opinion from some of us on that. But I think that some diseases have been eliminated, but not all. And I don't know the numbers to know whether or not coronavirus is able to be eliminated from the vaccines we have today, although maybe we can get a better one in the future. That said, Lawrence, go ahead. Lawrence Raybois? We can't hear you. I don't know if you're talking. I'm going to go to Richard and then Lawrence. If you can try to troubleshoot your audio, try to go to the zoom.us menu and go to preferences and play around with the audio settings and just make sure your microphone is set to the right mic and try testing the mic and make sure that the volume goes up. Richard, go ahead.
My grandmother died of diphtheria. Amongst the shots that children get now in the DPT for one, which is diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, and something else. You hardly ever hear of people getting diphtheria. I hardly ever hear, the only time you hear about pertussis is when someone gets it. There was an epidemic in California because people in the 70s and 80s stopped vaccinating their kids against pertussis. I personally have had it twice, and it was terrible. And I've gotten my DPT. But you can eliminate a disease if you can just make sure that enough people are vaccinated and not susceptible, such that during the course that one person has the disease, the people he comes in contact with are not enough to transmit it to anyone who's susceptible. It's called the propensity of transmission. And that's how vaccines work, even though they're not 100% effective. You don't hear about people dying of tetanus very occasionally. You very rarely hear people dying of rabies. You don't hear people dying of pertussis except in small religious groups that don't take any vaccines. The same thing for polio. So there is a observed relationship between non-occurrence of the disease and vaccination.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's what I was talking about spreading virally is the rate of transmission. If it's more than one person that you transmit to for each person that gets it, that's called going viral, or like, keeping the virus in the wild. If you can reduce that to less than one person, that's how you eliminate the virus or the disease in general, is by making it die off faster than it spreads. If it dies off faster than it spreads, eventually it dies off. If it spreads faster than it dies off, then it keeps spreading. So thank you for sharing that, Richard. David, go ahead.
Okay, there is one funny or interesting thought or idea, is that the better the healthcare of a population, the more old people there will be, and also the more immunocompromised people there will be, because they would have, died off in youth, say, like in 150, 200 years ago, half or more, actually, I think it was 3/4 of babies didn't live to be a year. So that it was a much harsher environment, and hence you didn't have the aging populations that we have here. And at the time of the Spanish flu, there was far fewer 80 and over, say, or 75 or probably 70 and over people that would die off easily if something came along like the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu right now, the rate of death or mortality was like 17 times what it is with COVID. And that's in a younger population with less health care. So on the one hand, the less health care means a stronger genetic population, but also it means people don't have the backup to survive, like respirators and stuff like that. So there's an interesting balance that's also at play here as far as vaccines. They do keep people alive, but then something else comes along, and so then they have to have the backup for that, because their immune system wouldn't have survived the first vaccine or first illness or virus, say, had they not had the vaccine. So nature is very competitive, and it likes to eliminate those that can't compete at the same level. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And by the way, thank you, and I forgot your name, Fuller, but thank you for posting the excess deaths. And I looked at the numbers really quickly, and it looks like even if we attributed every one of the higher than predicted excess deaths to coronavirus itself, it only creates a 40% higher mortality rate than otherwise. And remember, we said just the difference between being vaccinated and boosted, reduces the chance of death by a half. So I think high level, and I can't do this like on the fly. My roots are very introverted, but I think that means that even if we considered every excessive death to be attributable to coronavirus, you're still safer vaccinating, even if 100% of them are because you got vaccinated, that those people were dying. But I have to look at it more carefully another time. It was Rachel, now that I see your name. So sorry, I forgot your name. I just remembered the last name for some reason. I don't know why things stick in my brain and don't. Susie, how are you? Tell us what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, I thought that we developed a pill or a pill for the COVID. Have we received? Do we have that now? Like you can take a pill to relieve the symptom or something for COVID?
I don't know if I forget what it's called. The alternative to COVID is, I don't know if that's a pill or not.
Yeah.
Ebu Shield. But I don't know of I think it's still a vaccine for COVID.
It's called
Yeah.
Paxlovid.
What's that?
Paxlovid.
Oh, yes.
Paxlovid?
Yes, thank
Paxlovid.
you. Thank you, Richard. My
Thank you.
neighbor, she took that. Yeah, Paxlovid. Yeah, she mentioned something like that, right? Does that do the work? Does it help? But she's young, so she just resting like for 14 days from work, and that she taking that. But at the beginning, I remember that COVID is just the spread of it is so important. It's attacked the vulnerable immune system of us. Like if we have something, if we're not fully healthy, then it will attack that part. I have a neighbor, she 50 some years old. She have 2 COVID shot already. And then she waiting for her booster, and she have symptom. She have symptom and waiting for the test result to come back. She had to go to the hospital. And, they said that once you're on the respirator, then you don't get off, So, and then for me, I have symptom, and with the test at home, it's so negative. I call my doctor, went to the doctor test, it's still negative. Just recently, like lost sense of smell, I have running nose, low rate fever. And she said that it's just a cold. So I don't know if that's a variant of COVID, because, the COVID test is only to detect COVID. And what I have is not COVID, it's a variant of it.
If it's a variant of COVID, Susie, it'll test positive for COVID. Any variant of COVID will test positive for COVID. Now,
okay.
the tests that test whether or not you test positive for COVID, I think they're like 55% accurate, the at-home test. So they're a little bit better than a guess. They're not super accurate. So you could test negative, but still have COVID. If you want to get a good test, go into a center and get a PVC test, and then get a PCV, PVC, someone correct me which one it is. But those tests are much more accurate. What is it?
PCR test.
PCR test. Thank you. I knew it was a 3-letter acronym that had P in it. Sorry, that's my memory. So take a PCR test. Those are the more accurate ones, and then you'll get a better read. By the way, I think I was wrong, Rachel, about the percent chance of deaths. Because actually it's looking at all, I won't go into the reasons why, but I think I was wrong about that. But the other thing that I noticed about excessive deaths is that the trend of having a higher excessive deaths happened in 2020, 2021, and 2022, but not 2022 to 2023. So that's an interesting observation, because people have still been getting, maybe it was the original vaccines that caused the problem. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was natural disasters. I think, they only show on the CDC site, back to 2018. And so it makes it look like it's a very clear pattern, but I don't know, all I can say is that whatever the trend was, it seems to have gone away, the excessive deaths. So that's an interesting thing to note. But I think my prior statement, I'm going to correct, and I think that I was wrong. But again, that's not with my introverted brain, which is the better one. Neri, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a question.
Yeah.
What is considered to be fully vaccinated? How is a person considered to be fully vaccinated? How many vaccines do they need to be fully vaccinated? And if they had two vaccines a year or two ago, like, what is considered to be vaccinated now?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that, Neri. That's a really important question, and it's one that I actually found myself criticizing the way that the data was tracked by all the organizations that I pulled it from, because they track, I won't say all, because there were 1 or 2 places that I tracked data that actually talked about fully vaccinated versus not fully vaccinated. That is the correct way to track it. And what that means to be fully vaccinated versus not fully vaccinated is, if you got the very first vaccines that were available, you're now on your 3rd or your 4th booster. In order to stay fully vaccinated, you need to get a booster every, I forget what it is, 8 months or something like that. I just get it when it comes out. In order to, but if you never got a vaccine, but you just got a vaccine for the first time like a month ago, you are fully vaccinated because you just got a vaccine. What happens is the vaccine, the mRNA in your cells, degrades over time and is no longer as strong. And so it's not as good at fighting against coronavirus. So you get a booster to boost the mRNA to fight the coronavirus. And so if you got the vaccine more than 8 or 10 months ago, you need a booster in order to boost your immune system again. And so what fully vaccinated means is that you have gotten a protective dose of anti-coronavirus mRNA vaccine or booster within the last 8 months, roughly. I'm going to guess, and someone could correct me if they remember the exact time at which a booster and the vaccine starts to wane off and they recommend a new booster. But it's something like that.
So the vaccine itself protects you for about a period of 8 months.
So it does
Or a
protect
year.
you for longer than that, but its effectiveness wears down. Just like if you get coronavirus itself, your natural immunity will wear down over time as well. So does a vaccine. And so, whether you get vaccinated or whether you get coronavirus naturally, both of them wear down because your immune system says, hey, I haven't seen that coronavirus in a while. Not going to worry too much about it anymore. And so suddenly, like, you're not as protected as you were before.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Hope that was clear. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention the antiretroviral, the drugs, the Paxlovid, whatever it's called. It's not a substitute for a vaccine. It does help. What it does is lower how fast the virus replicates once you have it. So it might help you get less sick if you take it or less severe symptoms, but you should still get a vaccine because it's not going to protect you next time you get an infection. So that's one of the things. Like definitely getting a PCR test is definitely most effective because then they're very accurate if done right. Because the home tests, they could be, I don't know what the actual percentage is, but you could have a lot of false negatives with those. So just if you think you have it, it's much better. I think they even have services now that they come to your house and visit and do it in your home if you can't make it to a place. I don't know if all insurance covers it or how exactly that works. Also getting boosters I think is very important because first of all, it raises your immunity level, it raises your antibody level, but they're also coming out with new ones for new variants. So the last one was a newer version. It was a bivalent vaccine. It works a lot better against Omicron. It's not as effective against the new strain that's going around, XBB 1.5. It's still very helpful, but it's not as effective. So hopefully there'll be a newer one coming out that addresses the shortcomings of the older one.
Thank you, Jean, for clarifying that. And the responsive medications have been a huge help in decreasing mortality rates for all people, vaccinated and unvaccinated alike. Trump got one of them when he got COVID, and he was in pretty bad shape for a while. But he got.
The good thing about mRNA vaccines, they're a lot quicker to develop, to actually manufacture new ones for new strains, and it also has a lot of other applications. They're currently testing cancer vaccine in the UK, which actually works for active cancer and might work for preventative. So it's very interesting where this is going to go.
Right. Yeah. One of my friends is a virologist, and she said that with the way that mRNA vaccines, it's literally like a 2-week period. When a new variant comes out, it's literally 2 weeks to design a new. Now that doesn't include the manufacturing.
It takes time to manufacture.
It doesn't include the manufacturing. Just to give the caveat, it doesn't include the manufacturing, but it literally takes the scientists 2 weeks to come out with a new vaccine to handle that new strain of coronavirus, which is very fast. I mean, that's pretty, that's magic, right? That's impressive. That within 2 weeks they can come up with a new booster. So, but thank you also, Jean, for mentioning the responsive drugs because, I definitely hadn't heard of a coronavirus pill vaccine, and it's more the those are the ways to, reduce your risk of death if you've gotten coronavirus, rather than ways to defend yourself against getting coronavirus in the first place, which is what the vaccines and the boosters are about. So Richard, go ahead. Good to hear from you again, Richard.
I got the first polyvalent booster in September. And then the CDC recommended that you get them, said that after 2 months, the effectiveness of the vaccine compared to non-vaccine goes down by 50%. That's just for catching it. So I went in December and got my 6th boost, my 4th booster, but the second polyvalent vaccine. According to the CDC, and the law from the CDC has been spreading, your insurance company should pay for a booster every 2 months. So I expect that in the middle of February, I will get another booster, maybe even for a new polyvalent, including the latest vaccine versions.
Interesting. I have not heard the 2 month time frame. That's new to me, so I'm gonna have to look that up. That would be a little discouraging. I get knocked out every time I get a Cronus vaccine. Like I'm out for a day, like half a day at least. I feel terrible. So Susie, why don't you go next?
Yes. I wanted to know, right, if we have any study about the fertility effect of having the vaccine. Because my daughter-in-law, who is a nurse for the longest time, she would not take the vaccine, but she needed that the most because she worked with the patient all the time. But she was saying that it might affect. She wanted to have kids, and something like that we will not know until like years later. The effect of the vaccine. So how are we going to deal with that?
No, you can find that out 9 months after the first vaccines came out. We're well into the time that we would know if there were fertility rate differences. So that's Googleable. I'll try to Google it, but you would be able to spot that pretty quickly if you're tracking it. And I would imagine that they are tracking it. You only need 9 months after the first vaccines come out to be able to see that type of thing. Maybe even less than that, because you can look at fertility rates earlier than 9 months. That's when you're having the baby. So
Right.
that data is probably available. I just didn't look it up. But
Right.
you should try Googling it, and I'll try as well. That said, I want to let Sean go next.
Hey, Gary,
Hey,
can you ask all our attendees here, raise hand if anyone here got COVID, so we would know the infection rate. I'm not like estimate. I'm not joking.
So far as I know, Sean, COVID is very viral, but it does not spread through Zoom. So we're not going to get it tonight, thankfully.
Okay.
So
Here's my idea. Okay. So far, I haven't get. I haven't got COVID. Okay. I know a lot of people got it. My neighbors.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
I thought he meant if we all raised our hand now. Anybody?
Yeah, this is what I said. Just raise a hand. So I like to know how many.
That'd be
you're
interesting.
saying you want to know how many people got the COVID shot? I mean, we'll let people,
yes.
we'll let
I've had the
people
virus.
voluntarily like.
Just raise your hand. If they lie, if they don't want, it's okay. If they concern our privacy, they don't want to do it, that's okay. I'm just asking.
We'll make it optional, but at the end of the event, Sean, what I want to do is say whether or not people are vaccinated, like fully vaccinated. Like actually, maybe I have people say like their current status and what they plan to do going forward, meaning like, here's where I am now, and then this is what I plan to do going forward. Like no more vaccines, or I'm going to stay fully vaccinated. I would love for people to do that at the end. So let's definitely do that at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
So far, I haven't got COVID. Of course, I'm fully vaccinated. Okay, I had my first booster and second booster. Number two, I'm very careful. Even today, I generally do not attend any indoor gathering. Okay. And also, for past 3 years, I did not take a vacation, okay? Because I really worry about the air, travel by air, because the airplane is so cramped, the space limited. It's very easy to get the virus. I'm not saying freak out of it, even though I don't think I will have any life-threatening symptoms. However, if you get a virus, still not pleasant, right? Is maybe got a fever. I don't know. We're uncomfortable. Well, many years to come. So why hurry? Wait 3 years. I mean, wait for 3 years. Not take a vacation is okay for me. So I'm okay.
Great, thanks, Sean.
Mhm.
David, did you have your hand up this time? Go ahead.
Yeah, yes, I lowered it and raised it. So this
Great,
isn't
great. Yeah,
a
that's what I thought it was
leftover.
another one. I just wanted to make sure.
It's not a leftover hand, it's a
I
new
didn't
hand.
think so. I didn't think so.
So it is an interesting question, long-term effects, both with you and potentially if you were pregnant, with a kid, because there are some diseases, viral diseases like kuru, which is something that the Papua New Guineans get. And it's from eating raw brain of people who have kuru, but it takes about 30 years to develop. So while I'm fully on to getting vaccinated, I recognize the fact that there could be something that is long-term and pops up unexpectedly. However, I would say that the pharmaceutical companies are really, you got as smart of people as you're going to get working on this. So if there was any indication or possibility indicated at this time that could happen, they would know about it. So I think it's a minimal risk, but it's just, for argument's sake, because somebody mentioned something about long-term risk for pregnancy or whatever. You don't wait, 9 months, sure, if there's some abnormality when the baby's born, you could maybe attribute it back to the vaccine. But really, the much more subtle risk would be, say, the incidence of viral cancer in babies where the mothers had vaccines during the 9 months. If that happened in 20 years or 30 years, it's a small possibility, but it's just theoretically, I think that was something that came up in my mind anyway. So I thought I'd just talk about it quickly. But I'm fully vaccinated, 5 vaccines, including 2 boosters, right? And I had, I think, COVID in Quebec. So I went to the pharmacist and they say, oh, you're not Quebecois, no vaccine test for you. So I don't know if I had it or not, because by the time I got back to Ontario, it was all over. So, and then I went to the doctor here and I said, well, give me the blood test, because I don't know if I had it or not. I kind of like to know. And she said, oh, we don't give it, you have to pay $75 if you want a blood test. And this is in Canada, right? Social medicine. You have to pay $75. There's a lot of viruses out there, respiratory viruses that are worse than COVID. Don't worry about it. And that was it.
Got it. Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Will, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, I was just thinking it'd be interesting to see, I mean, I can understand people might not want to say whether they've had the vaccine or not, but if you could have a hand raised later of who's had the virus, who's actually had it, how many have had the virus, would be very interesting just out of this little sample group. And I mean, I don't want to digress, but it was fascinating to see how human nature played out from the inception of this virus in early 2020. Here in Australia, every single case was advertised all over the news. The headline news service was documenting every single case and every single death, and it was sort of like just hysteria, I guess, for want of a better word. And then as it played out, it got to the point, and this is where it was interesting to see human nature, it just got too hard. And they said, all right, we've inoculated like 90% of the population had the vaccine. and then that's it. All bets are off. Do what you want. So went from like 30 deaths a day being headline news on every news channel to it then went off the charts. It was like, 300 a day, 500 a day, which was low in comparison to the States, I know, but per capita, it was very high, but people just had enough of it. It was all too hard. And you could see that with people, they don't wear masks because it's just too hard. And you could see these sort of narcissistic personality types that they're not going to forego any of their liberty, no matter what the consequences are for other people. And it was interesting to see this play itself out. It was an opportunity that the virus gave to observe this behavior. And it's very important to keep that in mind, because the next one could be, who knows what's down the road. I don't want to scare anyone, but you don't know what's cooking up. Ebola could be an outbreak, and there'll be people then who'll go, well, I don't care. I'm not staying in my house. And it's just an interesting sort of petri dish of human behavior, and our innate self-interest is always very close at hand. Anyway, it'd be interesting to see how many people actually had the virus at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. As far as who knows what's coming next, theoretically, the last time we had a virus like this, it was the Spanish flu, which if no one knows why the Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu, it's not because it originated in Spain. Little historical fact, it was originated, I don't remember where, but it was not in Spain. The only reason it was called the Spanish flu is because the Spanish media didn't suppress the Spanish flu, and so it got that name. But it wasn't actually, it didn't actually originate in Spain. They just were more free about sharing that it was going on. But this is a roughly 100-year virus, and so hopefully we don't have another one of these for another 100 years, but keep our fingers crossed. Meryl, that said, your turn. Lots of hands up.
Yeah, I'm neutral about the whole vaccine thing. I got COVID after I got boosted. So before I had, and I was exposed before I got boosted, but I didn't get COVID. I got it after I was boosted. I had bad reactions to the bivalent shot. So I'm reluctant to say, yeah, everyone's got to get vaccinated. And I think people's risk factors are different based on age, based on their comorbidities, based on whether they're living with people who are immune compromised. And I think one of the reasons for the lower death rate among people who got all the boosters is they're not doing things like indoor dining, indoor concerts, indoor events. They're staying close to home. They're really being more careful than most people are. They're getting their groceries delivered. So I think that's a factor. They're not putting themselves at risk of exposure so much.
It's an interesting hypothesis. I don't know, did you just come up with that yourself, or did you research behaviors of people that are vaccinated and boosted?
Well, the one person I know who never had COVID and has gotten every booster known to mankind, does not dine inside, does not go to indoor events, very rarely leaves her house, and she has not gotten sick. I know that certain activities are considered high risk, like the large indoor events, and staying away from events like that is, I guess, makes it less likely that you'll get COVID. And I think someone who gets boosted is more likely to stay away from those events.
Yeah, I would encourage you to Google and look for whether or not there's any studies on behavior of people who are boosted versus not boosted, because I just anecdotally for myself, I'm fully boosted, but I went to a Billy Joel concert like right after I got vaccinated, and I go out to eat all the time, and I go to the city, and I don't restrict my movement any way whatsoever because I'm fully boosted. I'm totally safe in my opinion. at this point, like, I got nothing to worry about. I don't want to spread the virus for sure, because there are people that are more at risk than me, but I can't live the rest of my life, living under a shell. So I just basically live my life normally. So all I would encourage you to do is to look for data that will back your hypothesis or refute it, and be open to whatever the data says. And I would encourage you to look for that kind of data, and then come with a data backed hypothesis rather than just a hypothesis. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Oh, no problem.
I'm saying I don't feel that I should impose my will on someone else. I don't like it when I'm imposed on, and each person's risk factors are different. I think you have a different risk factor if you work remotely versus going into a job site.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely understand where you're coming from there. And I will also say that the biggest risk lies to the people who are unvaccinated, and they're the ones making the choice to not vaccinate. And so, that's where the biggest mortality rates were. So, that's worth noting, is that the decision is on the individual, and I don't like to see anyone die prematurely. So that's where, when I looked at all this data, I said, look, the data seems to say we should get vaccinated and boosted, but ultimately everyone has to trust their own judgment and do what they think is right. I just want to try to combat misinformation like the mark of the beast and the coronavirus, the microchips from Bill Gates. Like, those, I think, are misinformation. And I don't want people to make a decision that will put their life at stake because of misinformation. I want them to do it because they think that it's the right thing to do for another reason that they can justify. If anyone has a good reason not to be vaccinated and boosted, I would love to hear hands up about reasons not to be vaccinated and boosted. If people have them, like, I welcome those kinds of opinions, and it'll give a broader perspective to the audience, since a lot of the people speaking up are pro-vaccine. And after doing this research, I became more pro-vaccine. But that said, I want to let Dennis go because there's still 4 hands up. So Dennis, go ahead.
I would like to pose a more philosophical question.
Sure.
The fact that we are having this debate, and it's not just here, it rages all over the place, is demonstrating the fact that there is a lot of mistrust between the people and the government, not just the government, the establishment in general, the government, the medical establishment, the press. And the first question that comes up is to what extent the establishment is to blame for the lack of trust. Like, where did they drop the ball? Where have they been wrong? Have they been too boneheaded, where unjustifiably confident, where they should not have been as confident as they were, and where they were sort of ideologically motivated in their advice rather than sticking to the truth, even as little as they knew at the time? It's an important question because COVID was not Black Death. But the next epidemic might very well be the Black Death, with a much higher mortality rate. And the lack of trust between the people and the establishment can prove fatal, not just to 2%, but to 20% or to 60% of the population. And I think that's the question that's worth debating. And I don't have an answer to that, not the direct answer. So I'm just going to pose the question and bow out.
I actually do have an answer to that, Dennis, and it's one that I've pondered over for, quite a few years now. And I think that the real blame lies in the lack of critical skills teaching in the population, because I think there's so much misinformation. The whole concept of that the mark of the beast is from, that the coronavirus is, sorry, the whole idea that people would find that a credible source, sort of speaks to me to lack of critical thinking skills, because, as we talked about in the presentation, there's no good reason to think that the coronavirus is the mark, or that the vaccine is the mark of the beast. And so I think the lack of critical thinking skills is, ultimately to blame for, a large portion of the distrust in government and the establishment, And ultimately, it's up to each of us to improve our critical thinking skills so we can better discern fact from fiction and wisdom from folly. And that said, I want to encourage people that have not spoken yet to raise their hands. We really want to hear from everyone. Everyone's opinion matters. So definitely feel free to speak up. With that said, I'm going to let Jean go.
Yeah, well, as far as long-term effects, nobody really knows them, but they're kind of impossible to predict. So, well, Kuru and mad cow disease are not very good examples of this because they're not viral, they're prion diseases. But what retroviruses do, they integrate yourself into your DNA. So it does pass on. If you have children, for example, a good chance it might pass certain pieces of it. But I actually read a theory recently that human brain evolution might have been accelerated by one of those retroviral diseases. So it might not always be a bad thing. So, I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about it because those things are unpredictable, and, you know, a new virus, completely new virus could pop up at any time. So I don't think things like that are just worth worrying about too much. As far as, I guess I'm lucky because when I get either COVID, the original shots or the boosters, I get barely a bruise. So for me, getting a booster is not an issue at all. And I was actually worried that it might be not working well on me. My body might not be reacting, but I got a test about a month after that, and the normal level of antibodies was like 0.8 something, and mine was over 2,500, which was still a limit, the cutoff. So I guess it is working, but I understand that's not everybody's experience. So I guess that's up to individuals how often they want to get boosted.
Great, thank you, Jean. A Byrne.
Thank you. I just want to say it's interesting. Just beginning with the idea of the skepticism towards the establishment. It's interesting. There's a great book on the Spanish flu, and it's really interesting to read a lot about the Spanish flu because the book by John M. Barry called The Great Influenza really outlines the fact that we've been through all of this before. So the great protests, the great skepticism, the great sort of pushback occurred during the Spanish flu. And one of the reasons why the second wave of the flu was so much worse was because of just fatigue with lockdowns and all the different measures. And people thought, well, the second wave can't be as bad as the first wave. Well, no, it was much worse and killed a lot more people. And also because, again, it was the end of World War I and a lot of people were traveling. And, you know, we've been through this. And what's interesting is the book makes clear is that the rates of skepticism rose quickly at the start of the pandemic and then disappeared very quickly after it ended. And in fact, the peak times of pro-vaccine sentiment have been when the smallpox vaccine and then the polio vaccine came into being, and then that's when, you know, you've never seen such solid support for vaccines and the efficacy. Now, I am very pro-vaccine, and partly because, you know, I work in the space. I'm a humanist, but also, you know, I was involved with the vaccine rollout in Fiji as a New Zealander when Fiji was suffering significantly from the Delta variant, and at one point had both the highest rate of rapid vaccination and the highest death rates from COVID at the same time. And what was very clear, countries like Australia, New Zealand, and you know, WHO and UNICEF and others were supporting this, was the areas in the cities where mass vaccinations was occurring and there was just enough time to get the second dose. The death rates were much lower than out in remote islands where, you know, for lots of reasons, and also, you know, obese populations, frankly, and with a lot of comorbidities and also older, they weren't really able to get there in time, and they'd fail in sort of, you know, digital health records, etc. And unfortunately, the death rates and the long-term sort of effect of COVID in those parts of Fiji were very significant. And we've seen this in other parts of the world as well. So, and I'll add the last thing is, you've been in New Zealand, we were in lockdown for 2 years, and, you know, eventually we opened it. And at one point you hear things like, well, New Zealand now has the highest rate of COVID infection. Well, that's true. If you went from 0 infection and you finally get a large part of the population vaccinated, but then you do release, then the jump from the lowest possible base of 0 is going to be, for a while, the fastest growing, but it's still tailoring off and is within the government's kind of acceptability rate of frankly, and nobody likes to do this, but of what they thought, COVID, how many people would die from COVID in New Zealand at a 90+% vaccination rate versus a 0% vaccination rate, which at the start of the vaccine, so of the pandemic. So I still think there's a lot to say around. A lot of people look back and say, well, if we hadn't been vaccinated, what would or wouldn't have happened? But if you're like with the Spanish flu, those that took measures and those that didn't, there's a lot of pain with taking measures, but ultimately, their death rates were lower versus the scary, again, listen to your experts, the epidemiologists and others would say, well, there's always this horrible fact that if you prevent a lot of deaths, but there are still deaths, and you went through all the pain of lockdowns and vaccinations, that there's still a part of the population that will stubbornly believe, well, if you hadn't vaccinated at all, it wouldn't have made any difference because it's no worse than the common cold. That is hard to overcome. That's not to do with facts, that's to do with a faith sort of based approach, and it's very difficult to break that down. So anyway, I just thought I'd share all of that because I did find when, in terms of the Pacific, skepticism around the vaccines was actually very low and uptake was very high when death rates are that high and people are like, well, those that are vaccinated in my population versus those that are not, there's a very clear difference. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you for sharing your experience. I want to let Anna go next because I don't think she's spoken yet, and I don't think Lori has either. So I'll let Lori go next. Rachel, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on pause for a minute and go to them, and then we'll come back to you. You can keep your hand up, Rachel. We'll come right back to you.
First of all, I am fully vaccinated. I've had I guess it's 4 additional boosters or whatever. It never even occurred to me not to. I remember as a tiny child when the polio vaccine came in, and my mother took me down to the school in Chicago, and we waited in line for hours to get that, and we're so grateful. And I don't understand why some people just think, oh, who cares? I care for many reasons. I have 2, my son and my daughter-in-law are school administrators. I have 2 kids who came home from their first year at college. One of them had COVID, even though fully vaccinated. I have another one who lives in a affluent city in Oregon, where the anti-vaxxers are very strong. Now, he was fully vaccinated, but he ended up with COVID. We almost didn't have Christmas because of this. So to me, if you don't want to get vaccinated, stay home, but stay away from me. I'm trying to live. And I think it comes down to, are you your brother's keeper or not? If you've decided you're not, okay, live with yourself. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Anna. I really appreciate your thoughts and contribution. Lori, did you want to say something?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I am interested in this group and this event because, yeah, I was interested in this group and this particular event because of the philosophy side. I was really happy when you started talking about the mark of the beast and the philosophical objections or thought processes to, not wanting to take the vaccination. And for me, I grew up in Baltimore with a family. Both my parents were at Johns Hopkins, and they're both, my father's in medical research and my hygiene. And so all of their friends, everybody they know, was working on COVID statistics, as well as, developing, interventions to the disease. And so, like, I hear them talk, and one thing I know that is a new kind of trend in thinking in the medical field, at least at Hopkins, is that vaccines act differently on different people, and that just as a disease acts differently in different people, so does the vaccine. And so also it was developed extremely quickly with a, strong profit motive. So there's a lot of, the possible, like, I know that Hopkins is, has a lot of its financing comes from military, and over many, I know from my own parents that things that were considered, appropriate medical treatments were later realized to not be as appropriate as I thought that they were. So I think that that is one reason why some people who, come from an intellectually stable background, not people who are delusional, but people who actually know something about, the medical industry and how it works. I think that's one reason why there's some reticence. I think that statistics in general are, they change over periods of time. Hopkins itself has changed in what they believe is, the origin of the disease. Pretty much people really do believe in medical communities that it was created in a lab. So I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually what people, at least in my small sample of my parents' friends, believe now. So that, and then I also want to talk about the mark of the beast. I think if you're going to take people's religion at an incredibly literal interpretation, like by saying, well, we've never seen a monster, right, coming out of the sea that has all these characteristics, so that immediately refutes the possibility that there is a beast. And then secondly, that, because it's in a vaccine in your arm and that's different than your hand, then people would not believe that that was the mark of the beast. Now, for context, I am fully vaxxed, fully boosted. I am a believer in, medical science, and I'm not a Christian. But I live in a rural community. I see a lot of people who, I have a lot of Christian friends, and I think that the interpretation of what the mark of the beast is as metaphorical as any other aspect of any other religion. I think the idea of the mark of the beast is really, at least from the people I know who believe in it, it's a kind of understanding of a kind of technological intervention in human life, and that we're going through an irreversible period of inviting or accepting technological intervention. And because this, those two things, that religion can be understood in a metaphorical way, and that medical science is not hard and fast and incontrovertible. Things do change. And 25 years later, people could be looking back and going, yeah, well, we thought that back in 2020 that this was, you know, a harmless vaccine. And in fact, now we've seen, you know, generations of people who have had effects from it. So just from a purely philosophical point of view, I think, especially when you're talking about a free thinking seminar, that it's really good to open up those possibilities in the discussion. And that's all I had to say. Thank you. I've really enjoyed.
Thank you, Lori.
Will you give a tip of your towel? I don't know.
Sorry. Busca una toalla, mi amor. Busca por ahí. Busca mami. Busca mami. Sorry. Sorry. My daughter's taking a shower. Totally hear you, Lori. And I admit, like, I have not had long drawn out discussions with Christians about why they think coronavirus is the mark of the beast. While you could claim that it's a metaphor for technological intervention, you could claim that about every vaccine that's ever existed in humanity, and most Christians have taken all the other vaccines. So, you know, whereas some Jews have not taken and still do resist the vaccines, you know, there are Jewish communities that resist measles and mumps, and there are outbreaks every couple of years in this area of the country of Jewish communities that have children that get these horrible diseases because they were never vaccinated. And so while I hear what you're saying, and I am very open to hearing the perspective, if there is someone here that thinks that the coronavirus vaccine is the mark of the beast, I would love to hear the perspective in which how you would differentiate between all other technological advancements like the refrigerator in the last 500 years. And do you have a refrigerator? The Amish are the only people that I know that really live like back in the day. And they're pretty cool people and live a very interesting life. And if we ever destroy all of the technology that exists in the world, the Amish are still going to be strong. So we at least have someone that will survive if that happens. But for the rest of things, I guess I have trouble distinguishing where the line is drawn on what's metaphorical and what's not. And so I would welcome the perspective of someone that thinks that coronavirus was the mark of the beast, but the other vaccines were not. Like, why make that distinction? As far as the profit motive for pharma, I totally agree with that point. And I will say I know people that did research for Big Pharma up until Big Pharma came to them and told them what the answers to the studies needed to be. And Big Pharma basically said, these are going to be, you know, your side effects can't include these things, et cetera, and told them what the answers to the studies were going to be. And, you know, then they said, look, I'm no longer interested in participating in this. And so I definitely know from people that I know personally that Big Pharma does doctor the numbers and try to doctor the numbers. And of course, that doctor's data is now out. So the other doctors that are still participating in getting the money from Big Pharma, they're giving the results that Big Pharma wants. So I am not one to trust Big Pharma, but I'm also not one to say that every single country in the world is doctoring numbers to protect Big Pharma, because every country in the world doesn't have a profit motive to protect Big Pharma. And so I would argue that the vaccines are still doing more good than harm, given the global view that I tried to take in looking at mortality rates and, you know, looking at the impact of taking the coronavirus vaccine and being boosted. That said, we're going to sort of wrap up in the next few minutes. I'm going to let Rachel and Richard go, and then I'm going to take a quick vote about whether or not people are, you know, for people that are willing to share, whether or not you're vaccinated, you're fully vaccinated, which we described what that means is that your vaccines and boosters are up to date. And then what's the plan going forward? Do you want to be fully vaccinated or no more vaccines and boosters? And so we'll ask that question after Rachel and Richard get to go. So Rachel, you first.
Well, I guess I just want to say at this point that I'm really grateful that I went after Laurie spoke, because I had been thinking that it seems most people in this particular group are pro-vaccine, And I have been vaccinated. However, I was hesitant initially because I was pregnant when I got the vaccine. I felt very pressured to do so. In fact, it was kind of like a threat held over me where I would have to wear a mask during labor if I did not get vaccinated. And then I also just wanted to bring up the point that has been kind of touched on, where I don't know still if I'm comfortable getting my 1-year-old, maybe not at this point, but eventually vaccinated against COVID. And, you know, just if anyone has thoughts on that particular issue of getting kids vaccinated. And then even like, just to play devil's advocate a little bit more, like I'm not necessarily convinced, even after all of this discussion, to get booster shots. And I apologize. I mean, everyone, I apologize. I feel bad even just like admitting that out loud. It's just,
No,
I do kind of, like Lori was saying, recognize that medicine and science is ever evolving, that there are always new findings that, you know, we may not understand today what we could understand in 10 years. Or someone else brought up the point, like, what if wait 30 years from now, we know that getting the vaccine in pregnancy does cause cancer, or, you know, some other type of thing, have some other sort of adverse effect. So yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, confess my genuine thoughts and feelings, even after learning from all of you, clearly sound of mind people who have done a lot of research into this.
yeah, thank you, Rachel, for sharing. You should never feel ashamed of sharing your opinion transparently. That's part of the second intention, is to share who you are and what you believe transparently with others. And then I would encourage you to have an open mind to what you hear back. Congratulations, by the way. My kids just turned 5, or about to turn 6. They are 5, and they are vaccinated. From my perspective, you asked for perspectives. You know, I wanted to make sure that I did what's in my control to prevent the spread of the virus, because I didn't want people that were at risk to get the virus from me or my family members, including my kids. My kids are at nearly no mortality risk. They're so young that their immune systems are great, but I don't want them to interact with someone who's much higher risk and end up essentially killing someone because they spread a virus to someone who was very vulnerable. And there are a lot of people who are very vulnerable in our global community here. And so for me, it's about doing what I can to minimize significant harm, which is part of the goal of the Freethinker Institute. And that's why getting vaccinated is important to me, for my kids, as well as for me as a, you know, as a parent and as an adult. I would be curious to know why you're hesitant to booster, if you'd be willing to share, just so that I can better understand that, or so that we can better understand that.
I guess it really feels, I mean, if you really want to get deep into it without going on too much of a tangent, I think I have this pretty deeply rooted mistrust of authority. But I loved your point that you brought up about it being a global, I guess at this point, epidemic, where if it were some sort of conspiracy or big pharma, which clearly can't be trusted on so many levels, like, then it would have to be every country doing that, and that seems highly unlikely. So yeah, if anything,
if
it's just
true,
like,
if that's true, we got way bigger problems than coronavirus vaccines to worry about.
100%. Yeah. So I appreciate you saying that, because I
Yeah.
think that there is just kind of this deeply ingrained mistrust of authority figures and just doing things because that's what the majority thinks should be done, or what is you know, that's what's being mandated.
Yeah, and I think that it's actually very healthy to have a mistrust for authority, and it's very dangerous to just trust authority blindly. And that's why I say that the thing that authority has done to lose our trust, in my opinion, is to lack the teaching of critical thinking skills, because it's the teaching of critical thinking skills that help us all be better citizens, better parents, better people. Is critical thinking skills helps us discern fact from fiction and wisdom from folly, which helps us make better decisions for everyone. But the problem is, people with critical thinking skills are much harder to lead than people without critical thinking skills. And so I think our government has consciously made an effort on both sides of the aisle to teach less critical thinking skills. Although I did hear from my sister that, and I won't say which president, but one of the presidents, you guys can look up which one, made a big concerted effort to teach more critical thinking skills in school. And she, as a teacher, when I complained to her about this, said, oh no, right now they are trying to teach critical thinking skills in schools, and this is how we're doing it. And actually they did have a pretty intense way of teaching critical thinking skills during that presidency, but then other presidents want to get rid of the entire Department of Education, which is a whole nother lack of critical thinking skills. Without any standardization to education, you have no standard of critical thinking taught whatsoever. So that said, I'm going to let Richard and then I'll let Meryl go, and then we'll take our vote because we're already at 4 after. So if we can try to keep it a little bit brief for Richard and Meryl.
I'll try to keep it brief. In the first year of the plague, as you all know, there were no vaccines. And I lost 4 friends from COVID. Last week, I saw an article, I think it was from the CDC, but I'm not sure. It might have been from Johns Hopkins. They looked at, let me rephrase that. As you know, people who are reluctant to get vaccinated seem to find a political home in the more conservative end of the political spectrum, rather than people who are more liberal. So what they did is they looked at counties which could be characterized as Republican and Democrat. And they found that the death rate from COVID was twice as high in the Republican counties. That's all I can say.
I don't want to add anything to that. I'm going to go on to Meryl. Thank you, Richard, for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Okay, so you asked why someone might not want to be vaccinated. It's because they may have had bad reactions to previous vaccines, either COVID or non-COVID, or they may know people who had bad reactions to the COVID vaccine. I think that's on a lot of people's mind. I am fully boosted. It's definitely on my mind because I did have bad reactions, and I don't mean just for a day. I mean for 3 or 4 days, and I am not sure if I'm going to get more vaccines because of it. I also know people who told me that they had bad reactions to the COVID vaccine, and I think that is why there are people that are afraid of getting either the vaccine or a booster.
Yeah, so Meryl, I would highly encourage you to look into the Evo shells, because I had never heard of it until I did all this research. And that is supposed to be the solution for people that had bad reactions to the COVID vaccine. And it does give a significant protection against COVID, but apparently doesn't have the negative reactions. But I think it's probably much more expensive. So you need to have, evidence that you had a bad reaction to the COVID vaccine, but it will still protect you significantly against COVID without hopefully the negative side effects of the vaccine. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm just, you had asked the question why people are shy of the vaccine. And I think I would point out that we wouldn't need the vaccine courts if the vaccines were totally safe and effective.
Yeah, so all vaccines have like a response. Like I get the flu vaccine every year. Ever since I got the flu without the vaccine, I almost I was in very bad shape. I thought my life was at risk. I was in really bad shape when I got the flu, and I get the flu vaccine ever since then. But when I get the flu vaccine, I'm always sick for a day. And like I said earlier, when I get the COVID vaccine and the boosters, I'm always sick for a day or half a day at least. And so there's always some sort of negative reaction to every vaccine, like for all vaccines. But the question is whether or not that small harm is worth the protection that the vaccine provides you of having the mortality rate or better versus not getting boosted. And so all I would do is encourage you to consider whether or not being half as likely to die of COVID is worth you know, a day or even a couple of days of sort of negative symptoms, and you all obviously have to make that decision for yourself. That's a personal decision. For me, I felt like even though I get out for half a day and even though I work really intense hours, I felt like it's totally worth getting the COVID vaccine, not only for myself, but also to prevent the spread to other people, which is what I care about even more than protecting myself, because I'm also not in an at-risk demographic. And so, you know, my life is not at risk for COVID right now either, but I don't want to spread it to someone else and end up inadvertently killing someone else without having meant to, or without ever having even known that I did. And so those are some other things to sort of keep in mind when you're making your decision. That said, I do want to ask everybody, and I'll let David say his point while people are voting. But I do want to ask everybody to say in the chat, and I'll lead it off, you know, whether or not you're vaccinated, whether or not you're fully vaccinated, and what your plan is going forward, for anyone willing to share. And I will put my answers in. And so for anyone willing to share, I would love to have people you know, share whether or not you're fully vaccinated, whether or not you're vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and what your plan is going forward, whether or not you plan to stay fully vaccinated or not stay fully vaccinated. And that said, I'm going to let, while people type that into the chat, I'll let David go.
I was just going to clarify that it's not that the vaccine wears off, it's that your immune system gradually gets lazy or less effective. So it's always the curve of the immune system response that we're talking about. The vaccine itself does its work in a couple of weeks, and that's the end of it. It doesn't stay in the body or anything like this. And of course, along with the immune response dropping off, there's also the virus itself mutating. So it's really hard. It's kind of a moving target versus a immune system that, you know, some people it's better than others, but generally the trend is down for your immune system over the course of time. But the curve angle itself varies tremendously between people. And some people only need a couple of vaccines and they're good for life. But the general population needs boosters periodically, they think, so far as we know. So I just wanted to clarify that, because it's not that the vaccine decreases in your body over a period of time, it's that your immune system, it's all about the immune system. And in fact, it's interesting, people who would have died young because of weak immune systems now are facing COVID mortality because they've been sheltered, virally sheltered by our modern medicine until they get old, and then their immune systems are really dropped off. And well, I don't know what my point is, other than the fact that modern medicine is creating a pool of people whose immune systems are not as strong as perhaps historically they would have been. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chet. Thanks, David. So with that, I want to let people, I want to thank everybody for joining. Jeff, thank you for sharing, by the way. I'm sorry to hear about that experience. You know, I do want to thank everybody for joining and sharing their opinions and their beliefs and their feelings. And I hope everyone felt that they were comfortable and that they were welcome to share whatever opinions they had. That's really important for this community, that everybody feel welcome to share their opinions transparently and, you know, not be yelled at or judged, or, you know, we can disagree with each other. And one of the hallmarks of that I want to become a part of our community at the Freethinker Institute is that we can share really deep, controversial opinions, but come to different conclusions after listening to each other with an open mind, and still be able to agree with each other and still be able to be friends. And, you know, if we can pull that off, that's something that I think this world needs more of, is the ability to agree to disagree and be able to, you know, share deep and meaningful opinions with each other without alienating other people just because we come to a different conclusion. So I think it's really important that we have more open-mindedness and less judgment, but just share good ideas with each other and let everybody decide for themselves what are good ideas and help keep boosting each other's critical thinking skills so we can make better decisions as a group. So, or as individuals within that group. So that said, hope that everybody has a great rest of their night. Thank you all. We ran a lot longer than we usually do. And so this is past my bedtime. I was up at like 4:30 or 5. So and my kids have to go to sleep too, because they wake me up early. So hope everybody has a great night. And thank you all for coming. Hope to see you all next week, and hope that you all join the online community so we can continue the conversation there. We have really good philosophical conversations on there as well. And someone mentioned they like the philosophical nature of some of the stuff that we talked about. We are normally more philosophical, although there is philosophical aspects to this, as we talked about. There are philosophical aspects to this as we talked about, but sometimes we delve into very philosophical territory, and we always focus on practical philosophy though. So almost always. We did talk about free will, which is not super practical, but so anyway, I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you everyone for coming, and nice chatting with you all.
Good night, Garrett.
Bye-bye.
Your daughter was trying to tell you about your bedtime. You better hurry.
She was like, Daddy, get me a towel. It's time to go to sleep.